Morning, and thank you for joining the Extended Day Ahead Market Working Group 2 meeting related to the transmission commitment and congestion rent allocation. My name is Elisandra Casillas from the California ISO Stakeholder Affairs Group, and I will be providing support for the meeting. Deb Levine is the facilitator assigned to this working group, and Emily Hughes is the scribe. Along with Phil Pettingill, who is listed as a panelist, is a coordinator overseeing all three of the active EDAM working groups. The meetings for this working group are held weekly on Tuesdays and Thursdays from 9 to 11 a.m. Participation details for each of the meetings is available on the ISO's public calendar. Next slide, please. Meeting reminders. These working groups are intended to be collaborative, and we encourage participants to share ideas and perspectives during these meetings. If at any time you have a question, please raise your hand and the facilitator will call on you. And as a reminder, please state your name and affiliation first so that the rest of the group knows who's speaking. The working group meetings are recorded and video files are posted on the corresponding working group web pages. Please request permission from the ISO before reprinting these transcriptions. Stakeholders are also welcome to present their perspectives at these meetings. If so, please submit a request to present using the inquiry link located on the resources slide at the end of this presentation. The materials related to the Working Group 2 meetings are posted on the associated webpage, which is also linked on the resources slide, along with other links to help you engage in the EDAM stakeholder process. Next slide. For today's agenda, after my welcome and introductions, I will turn the meeting over to Deb Levine to kick off today's meeting. Then she will proceed with a Working Group 2 status check, then close with upcoming topics. And with that, I'll turn it over to Deb Levine.
Thanks so much, Ellie. Good morning, everyone. We're going to go ahead and continue on the status check, starting off with the part 2 of the deck on transmission buckets. Next slide, please. So as we've talked all the way along, we're looking at putting in place the original 3 buckets. Bucket 1 would support the resource efficiency. It would consist of both point-to-point and network transmission, versus bucket 2 would be voluntarily made available to the EDAM, and it's firm, conditional point-to-point that gets you to the transfers. And I'll let Milos come in a second with the additional notes on the bottom. And then lastly, bucket 3 would be whatever is unsold or unreserved at the close of the day ahead market, which is 10 a.m. in the morning. And at this point in time, we have talked that the rates for that transmission would be the applicable OAT rate for the entity, EDAM entity that is providing the transmission. So Milos, would you like to talk a little bit more about the additional notes that were added on the bottom of the bucket 2 and bucket 3?
Good morning, everybody. This is Milos with the California ISO. I don't know that if I think we have slides a bit later that you know, when we get to bucket 2, we can jump into that right now, or if you want, I think you have some additional slides that kind of walk through bucket 1 first and then get to bucket 2. I'm comfortably the way you want to take it. If we want to start with bucket 2 and that note, then I think we have to drop down to a few slides that I put together, I think 3 slides on that topic.
Oh, okay. Sorry, I misunderstood. All right, operator, next slide, please. So as we've talked on the timeline, we have had some additional discussions internally. And for the 9 a.m. run, all that we would need is, you know, if there are any outages on the transmission, whatever you have for bucket 1 for the resource efficiency would need to be available. That data would need to be available at 9 a.m. But we wouldn't need to have the bucket 2 or bucket 3 data until 10 a.m. So that will give you actually an additional hour for OAT sales that are not associated with resource efficiency. Then at 10 a.m., when the EDAM bids are due, you would go ahead and incorporate in that submittal into cyber the bucket 2 and bucket 3 transmission. We'd run the market from 10 to 1, and then at 1 o'clock, you would get your schedule and awards along with a report that tells each one of the entities that had provided transmission which transmission was not used in the market, so then it could be used again for OAT sales. The thought process that we had talked about was to go ahead and, while as an OAT entity, you could go ahead and still take bids for OAT transmission, just not complete that transaction until you're assured at the 1 o'clock reporting that that transmission had not been used in EDAM. Because we're trying to make sure that in EDAM, we have firm transmission that is going to be available for real time and is not going to get recalled. So with those 2 slides, any questions before I jump into more details of each one of the buckets? Operator, could you open the line for Justin Thompson, please?
Morning, this is Justin Thompson from APS. At what time would tags have to be completed by under this scenario?
So currently the discussion is that tags wouldn't have to be done until after the 3 o'clock time frame, after the, as is done normally. So you tag about 3 o'clock for the following day, or if it's shorter transmission that's thought after the fact, you tag whenever you buy the transmission and are ready for the transaction. So the tagging rules that are in place today are not intended to change underneath this. And George, if that's incorrect, please jump in and kick me underneath the virtual table.
No, Debbie, that's fine. We need the bucket 1 designation by 9 a.m. The other buckets can be made available by 10. So that's the only reason we need bucket 1 by 9 is to use it in the advisory RSC that we will run at 9. That's the reason.
But the tagging doesn't have to be done until the 3 o'clock time frame, right?
That's the current process right now. Usually the tags come later after the market when participants know their schedule commitments. Of course, if it's available and can be submitted even before the market runs, we will accept it. We would like this information, but current practice is it usually arrives after the market.
Right.
And
okay.
Deb, let me just jump in there and clarify again. And George and others, correct me if I'm wrong, but throughout this, at least at this stage, we're not necessarily dictating different tagging rules or tagging requirements. Rather, whatever the tagging requirements the parties have in place today, those would continue. Some parties may know and have sufficient information for certain transactions to be able to submit tags, in the day ahead time frame, 3 p.m. Others may not necessarily have sufficient information by that time frame. But this timeline is really just talking about how is transmission made available to the EDAM for optimization, and we're not necessarily dictating the tagging timelines at this stage. I know that parties have put forward that there should be a tagging timeline in the day ahead time frame, but I think we've heard from others as well that may not be possible based on certain types of arrangements that parties rely upon, like firm energy purchases, where some of that information may not be known by 3 p.m. and day ahead, may be known a bit later. So we're not necessarily dictating the tagging timelines here yet.
Okay, operator, could you open the line for Kevin Smith, please?
Hey, good morning. Kevin Smith, Bouncing Authority, Northern California. Thanks for the timeline's helpful. I think I had raised this question about the processing hold. And I know that, we're looking at for the EDAM optimization 3 hours, but I think the concern that I've had raised internally is that, effectively we have a 4-hour lockout. And I was hoping that maybe there could be something done about that, just because it has come up as a concern. But, even though the oat sales are done up till, I guess, at 9 a.m., I think the issue was, is there any way to truncate that from 1 p.m., but apparently not. And I just want to confirm that, George.
Yes, unfortunately, yeah, while the market is running from 10 to 1, we cannot be changing the information that is used to run the market. So that's why everything is taken in as an input by 10 a.m. and then there's no additional input that goes into the market. The market proceeds with that information. So then everything is published by 1 p.m. when all the market passes are concluded. So that's why you have this window from 10 to 1 that even if some information change, it won't be looked at by the market that's running at that time.
So oat sales couldn't continue to 10?
Yeah, as long as we have those this information by 10.
Okay, all right. That's where I was getting confused. I see the oat processing hold from 9 to 1. So, and oat sales ending at 9. I mean, that at least takes an hour off of it. So in other words, we could provide all available ATC to CAISO at 10 a.m. and not 9 a.m.
Or releasing bucket 2 and bucket 3, right? That's fine. Yep. For bucket 1, we want it by 9.
So no, but bucket 1, I'm not. That's not the issue on bucket 1 because that's already off the table in my mind. What I was trying to get at is that period of the so-called freeze or hold period that's 4 hours, and I had some internal folks who had asked whether that could be shortened, and at this point we know it can't be shortened from 1 p.m. but possibly yes, okay, that helps. Thank you.
Yeah, let me clarify what we refer to freeze for data at 9 a.m. reflects the outages. So we don't update outages after 9 a.m. And also we don't update the demand forecast. We want the information that is made available by 9 a.m. that will be used in the resource efficiency evaluation not to change between 9 and 10 when potentially EDAM entities are trying to cure their shortfall from the advisory RSC. We don't want them to try to have a moving target for that. So that's why we're praising the demand forecast and the outages and things like that. But for the transmission that will be released to the market, 10 a.m. is the cutoff time.
Okay, thank you, George. Appreciate it.
You're welcome.
All right. Operator, could you open the line for Doug Boccignoni, please?
Doug Boccignoni for the Bay Area Municipal Transmission Group. So the parties who procure the transmission prior to, I guess, 10 a.m. will then have to decide, are they going to designate that as bucket 2 transmission to be available to be optimized in the EDAM, or whether they submit a self-schedule at the intertie in the market, and then it's not optimized by the EDAM. It's a sort of a fixed self-schedule in the market run. Is that correct?
So the self-schedule at the intertie for a transfer is only for exercising a contract when that transfer is associated with a contract path of a transmission contract and the participant wants to exercise their scheduling rights by self-scheduling. We provide some examples on that, but this is a very narrow exception to the rule. Normally, no schedule is submitted for the transfers. They're optimized by the market. So the market determines optimally what the schedule is going to be for a transfer. So the self-schedule route is only for exercising a contract, a transmission contract that has part of its contract path a designated transfer for it. Okay.
So okay, that's helpful. So I'm trying to understand then what would a party be doing who was procuring these rights from the EDAM BAA? I guess they'd just be deciding whether they thought their bucket 2 revenues would exceed the cost of those rights. They're not going to be allowed to bid at the intertie, right? So
not for transfers, no. But releasing the transmission capacity as a bucket 2 for the market to use potentially would provide transfer revenue based on what we discussed in previous calls on this work group. So this is the incentive for making transmission capacity available to the market, besides the overall efficiency that the market can achieve with it.
right, but I guess what I'm trying to get at is they wouldn't be allowed to bid at the intertie, right? So they're not, if they're buying this transmission, up to 10 a.m. from the BAA, all they're going to do is be able to get their share of the transfer revenues. They're not going to be able to submit an economic bid at the intertie,
because the bid, of course, it's a transfer. So the bid is submitted at the resource. The resource is somewhere inside an EDAM BAA. So all these bids from all the resources are evaluated by the market, and then the schedule on the transfer is optimally calculated based on all the bids that are submitted. So you wouldn't need a bid on the transfer because it already reflects the economics behind it of all the resources that are bidding in the BAA.
Yeah,
so
great, thanks. It's helpful. I guess I'm thinking about sort of the ramifications for what Kevin Smith was asking. It seems like, having to wait until the market run happens. I mean, that's just like the reality that we're in here. It's like, I'm having a hard time thinking about what would be you wouldn't
submit bids.
You wouldn't be able to, you wouldn't know until you had the information for the market results. There really wouldn't be a purpose of making these additional transactions.
Well, I'm not following. Are you talking about acquiring transmission?
Yeah, exactly. I think what Kevin was saying was, hey, that's a long time, 4 hours to wait. I think now we're talking 3 hours to wait if they can do it all the way up to 10 a.m. But it's like, I don't understand. I mean, it'd be at that point too late to do anything with that transmission for the next day until you knew the results of the market run. And then we're only talking about doing something that then you're going to be able to exercise in real time. But when you're exercising it, you're not bidding at the intertie, you're not self-scheduling at the intertie, you're just deciding whether you're going to get your share of the transfer revenues.
To get the share of the transfer revenues, you have to be among the transmission customers that are making the transmission capacity available to the market. So if you have acquired transmission and you want to make it available, say as bucket 2 by 10 a.m., that's a different process from bidding the resources, which can happen even 7 days in advance, right? And the market closes for that also at 10 a.m. So I hope we're not confusing those two, right?
No, what am I trying to say? So this transmission that Kevin, that Kevin was referring to, that the BAA might want to sell, that the only thing the party who's buying it can do with that to realize value is to, in cyber, enter it and turn it over to be optimized. There's no other function that they can use that for, right? So the only reason they would buy it is if they thought the transfer revenue that they were going to get exceeds the cost. And I guess my point is, if they haven't bought it by 10 a.m., waiting until 1 p.m. to buy something that then you're going to, all you use it for is to get the EIM value. I guess I just don't see the problem that's created by this delay.
It's a little difficult because I'm not familiar with the process of selling and buying transmission. So in my view, there is some transfer capability. Let's say there is an ATC, there is a certain amount of unencumbered transmission that the EDAM entity has, and they could release it to the market, or they could sell it to transmission customers, and the transmission customers can release it to the market instead by 10 a.m. As long as all this transmission is made available to the market, from a market perspective, we'll use it in the most efficient way. And obviously, we cannot do it after 10 a.m. because the market now has started. So
exactly. I think what we're talking about is which party is going to get the financial value that will be realized. Is it going to be the BAA directly because they didn't sell it, that just got released to the EDAM, or is it going to be a third party who buys the transmission capacity from the BAA, and then that party is going to get the value? That's it. There's no other. There's no impact on the market run.
Well, and Doug, let me see if this helps as well, and maybe Kevin can jump in to provide his thoughts on it. But keep in mind, when we're talking about bucket 2 transmission and bucket 3 at this stage, or at least bucket 2 transmission we're talking point to point. You could have, I could see potentially certain network customers or native wanting to potentially designate some additional resources during this time frame, and they may need that ATC. But those are some uses potentially, of that ATC that maybe Kevin is concerned about, and just holding, not making sales on the DOs, and there may be parties that may still want that from transmission if they're network customers trying to designate resources or something to that effect. But maybe Kevin can opine as well on that.
You mean like there might be a customer that needs to acquire some additional transmission to serve their own load?
Yeah, Doug, hold on a second. Operator, can you open up Kevin Smith's line, please?
Thanks, Deb.
Well, I was actually going to confess that I got a little distracted there, so I apologize, and I wasn't following all the back and forth, Doug. I guess there are different stripes of transmission, monthly, so forth, and I guess what I was understanding is that if somebody did buy up to, they could schedule that a transaction, and it would have value. They could use it for moving something from Cobb to Tracy, Captain Jack to Tracy. They could pick that up. And so
I don't think so. That's what George said. No, you can't.
What do you mean?
You're just going to get the financial right.
Hold on. Kevin, can you repeat what you said? Make sure that we're all on the same page.
Well, if somebody is buying point-to-point transmission from Captain Jack to Tracy, I'm just using an example, they should be able to schedule that transaction. They're moving energy from the Northwest to Tracy, and they're using a point-to-point right that they acquired off of Oasis. And so I guess I'm losing why they wouldn't be able to continue to do that. I mean, look, I'm not a tag expert. There may be other things that come in, and it's not necessarily just an hourly or day. I mean, they could buy a monthly ATC, you know, a point to point, a monthly right. So, you know, it would have value outside of just the immediate day. So maybe I'm missing something in the discussion. I still see it as value. I think the concern was raised to me, and Doug, maybe I haven't thought about it at a level that you are, and maybe there's a logic I'm missing here. So I was merely trying to convey a concern that was raised to me by one of our transmission providers, that they saw the lockout of 4 hours as potentially being problematic. And so maybe I need to rethink what those impacts are, and I'm not understanding something. But maybe George, if you could comment on what I just threw out.
Yeah. So I'm trying to make the distinction that I tried to make earlier. I'll try again. So if the transmission right that a customer has acquired, they want to exercise this right, they're going to use this transmission for themselves, they want to exercise the right, then this is, it has to be registered or declared as a transmission contract based on the examples that we provided earlier, okay? And then this is the only case that you can actually self-schedule the ETSRs, essentially the transfer. In the case where they want to simply release that transmission capacity for market use and participate economically, then you don't self-schedule the ETSRs. You just submit the scheduling limit on the transfer, which reflects how much rights you have and you release in the market, and then the market will use it to optimally schedule a transfer based on the economics that are reflected by the bids at the resources that are submitted. So you have those two, and I'm trying to distinguish them, make sure that it's clear, the distinction, right? So you want to use the right for yourself, you have to register it or declare it that this is a transmission contract, so we can tell it apart, right, with all the parts, the way we had the example. And then you can self-schedule the transfer, and this one is not optimized because it's self-scheduled. Or you can simply release it, whatever bucket it is, and specify the scheduling limit, and then the market will simply optimize it. And in that case, you will receive the transmission revenue for it. For the transmission revenue, we said it goes to the transmission customer that makes this transmission capacity available. We could coordinate this with the EDAM entity so that we don't have all these independent registrations of these different transfers. The EDAM entity could register or a specific, not a specific, a bucket 2 transfer that reflects all the ATC and keep track of the transmission customers. And then when we give the transmission revenue to the EDAM entity, they can distribute that among their transmission customers for that bucket 2, let's say. So there are different ways to do it. I don't want to get into the details. As long as we understand that there is the distinction of intending to use your rights or release it to the market. Okay, this is the difference.
Yeah, and I understand that distinction fully, and that's where I guess I was tripped up with Doug's question, because I thought, maybe Doug, you can answer, I thought you were focused more on the second scenario where it just gets released and optimized. But if somebody purchases the transmission and they're going to move 100 megawatts north to south on COTP, that they would self-schedule that 100 megawatts. It wouldn't be optimized, but they would have the full right to utilize that capacity for that transfer. Conversely, they could make a decision they're going to buy it and let it get optimized because they think there may be some revenue derived from that. But that would be releasing the transmission and not scheduling on it, not self-scheduling or reserving it.
Right, but I think you talked about a scenario where they would purchase the transmission maybe I just misheard you, but I thought you said they could bid at the interties, but
No, I wasn't talking about bidding. I'm talking about somebody buys a point-to-point right off of Oasis and, exercises that right because they're marrying up, a delivery at Captain Jack of 100 megawatts, from somewhere mid-sea or wherever, and they're moving it down to Tracy. And so they buy that 100 megs off of the Oasis. It could be SMUD, it could be WAPA, it could be tank. And, how that is handled would be a self-schedule of that 100 megawatts that would preserve that capacity from being optimized in the market. It would be, outside of it, that would be them exercising their right. And then you start getting into issues where they only do 40 megawatts, okay, of the 100. Now what? But that gets into a whole bunch of other issues. So, I think
we're talking about the same thing. The point I was trying to make is that, as what George described, that to exercise that right, it really has to be registered, right? So I think parties were talking about, like envisioning something that could happen in cyber kind of on the fly.
Oh, I'm kind of going where I see what you're saying, Doug. Is there time or even the ability to register that specific path for that quantity? And I would think it would all be in there. Okay, that's a George question.
Yeah, and I guess what I'm thinking about is what we're really talking about here is, why would somebody buy that transmission? And, they're either going to buy it because they think if there's this ability to get it registered and submit a self-schedule, that they think the value of that self-schedule, the value they'll realize, will exceed the cost. Or they're going to turn it over as bucket 2 because they think the value of the ETSR is going to exceed the cost. But, one way or the other, or the third option is nobody buys it and it gets just released, or somebody buys it and doesn't self-schedule it and doesn't turn it over as bucket 2, but it still automatically gets released and gets used. But, I think in all those scenarios, there's a value that's determined, and all we're really talking about is which party is getting that value. What is it the point-to-point value that the third party is getting? Is it the ETSR that the third party is getting, or is it the ETSR value that's going back to the BAA?
So if we're talking about the transfer revenue, the transfer revenue, if that's the value, right? The value of the transmission is the transfer revenue. This is how much the transmission is, that's the marginal price of the transmission that translates to the transfer revenue. And this is the price differential between the BAAs that this transfer is joining them. So that's what you're looking at. So if there's a price differential, because let's say a scheduling limit is hit on the transfers, or because a bucket 3 transmission is used that has a hurdle rate, right? So in any of these cases, you have a price differential between the PAAs, and that translates to transfer revenue on the transfer, and that's the value if you want to quantify it.
But George, isn't there a third potential value, which is if it's the value of the self-schedule? Because I think that's going to be computed and settled slightly differently from the ETSR value, right? And
so in the case of the self-schedule,
to arbitrage those two differences.
Well, there are two different scenarios, right? With the self-schedule, essentially, you are scheduling on your contract, and now the transfer revenue provides the perfect hedge for your schedule, right? So based on the example that we showed in the last call, right? So you have the option of either optimally participating in the market, releasing the transmission, and then you could collect the transfer revenue, or schedule on it. That's the self-schedule route, in which case the transfer revenue provides the perfect hedge for your schedule. Okay, so these are the two alternatives that we laid out. And we also laid out a third alternative that you may want to, for some reason, I don't know, not release it and not schedule it and, reserve it for real time. That's another case, right? So.
Okay, let's go ahead and move on.
Thank you.
All right, thanks, Doug.
Hey, real quick, Doug, let's maybe talk offline too, and we can kind of pull this together. I want to make sure I understand what your questions are, and I'll figure it out, or maybe not. Thank you. Thanks,
Great.
Doug.
Thanks.
And
Thanks,
George.
everyone.
Appreciate it, everyone. Yep.
Okay, operator, can you open up the line for Tong Wu, please?
Hi, this is Tong Wu from WAPA. I think I can understand what Doc's question was, but I have some questions first. So we're talking about this using the same assumptions. I think there are three kinds of transmissions. One kind is between a EDAM BAA and a non-EDAM BAA. For example, hypothetically, if bank joins EDAM and BPA doesn't, and then that's the situation at Captain Jack at COTP. And you have one entity that doesn't join and the bank joins, and then you will still have those self-schedules, whatever normal business, right? And then there is this holding for oath. This would apply because that's still regular business. So that's one kind of transmission. The other kind is between a EDAM BAA and the EDAM BAA. Now, for example, hypothetically, if a BPA joins, a bank joins, then at the COTP at Captain Jack, then you would have two EDAM BAA. There, I think, would be the question, what does hold for oath mean? Because you may or may not be able to self-schedule at Captain Jack anymore because both sides are EDAM BAA. It just transfers. It's going to be optimized. Of course, then there's a question, do you still want to be able to self-schedule? I think that's one of the questions in the questionnaire that the ISO provided for people to answer, right? And the third kind is that's within a EDAM BAA. Let's say if bank joins EDAM and then within bank there are transmissions. So is there any issue with hold for hold? So I don't think the previous conversation that we had, we kind of explicitly stated which scenario we're talking about. I think Doc was talking about the second one when there are two EDAM BAAs, then there's an intertie between the two EDAM BAAs. After 10 a.m., what's the value of that transmission? Because you can no longer, let's assume if the ISO does not allow people to self-schedule, you would not have any opportunity to use that transmission anymore, right? But I think there are just different scenarios. Maybe that's why we talked past each other. So maybe George can help. So when we're talking about these buckets, okay, are we talking about like non-EDAM BA, EDAM BA, EDAM BA, EDAM BA, or internal? This bucket concept, in which scenario would it apply?
So, Tong, every time we talk about buckets, it means transfers. And every time we talk about transfers, that's always EDAM to EDAM. So I think Doug and Kevin and myself for sure, we were talking about this scenario, EDAM to EDAM. Because if you are talking non-EDAM to EDAM, then that's not a transfer. This is just an import or an export. And we were not talking about that. And if it is internal transmission, there's nothing to talk about because this is, as we said, whatever is in the full network model, we don't even see it as a specific transmission facility with any different meaning than what you see in the network model. So we're definitely talking about EDAM to EDAM transfers. That's the only case that you will have a discussion about packets, okay?
I see. So I see. But the ISO's questionnaire has a question. about internal transmission, whether there's hurdle rate or what. Did ISO make a mistake in that question, or ISO did want to ask people whether there's going to be hurdle rate and for transmission internal to a BAA?
We on purpose.
Go ahead.
I was going to say, Tom, we on purpose asked that question because we had not come to a resolution on that issue yet, which is why it's in the comments questionnaire.
I see. Yeah, you know, we were looking at these questions yesterday. It seems we didn't know really how to answer because we didn't really discuss this. We don't know the context. We don't know what, you know, these questions really are.
Well, the questions are based on the discussions we've been having over the past 7 weeks, and particularly with respect to the hurdle rate for bucket 2, that was in the discussion that James Lynn, and if you go back to the Excel spreadsheet, you'll be able to see what the differences are between having hurdle rates and not having hurdle rates.
For internal transmission?
Irregardless.
Let me clarify, Deb, if I may. This is Milos. What we've been talking about is squarely in the context of the buckets, not internal transmission, any kind of hurdle rates. The question that we pose, and we'll get to it once we get to the different definition of the buckets, is in the context of these buckets. The buckets apply in the context of transmission at the interfaces between EDAM balancing authority areas, what George said, transfers. I don't want to confuse this with discussion of internal transmission, because George, we talked about internal transmission and how that's made available in the prior meeting. The question that we pose, and again, we'll get to it once we get further down in the slides, is an open question that stakeholders wanted to pose, and we can discuss a little bit more on, is bucket 2 transmission at the interfaces between balancing authority, EDAM balancing authority areas. The starting point is transfer revenue, congestion rent, as the mode of compensation for making that transmission available. Parties did raise the question, should there be a hurdle rate associated with bucket 2 transmission, that I think we can entertain and we can discuss more once we get to those slides, but that's not in the context of internal transmission. So let me see if that helps a little bit. And I thought the question that's been posted was in the context of bucket 2 transmission. The buckets, again, all throughout these discussions, we've been talking about it in the context of, we went through each bucket individually with scenarios as interfaces between 2 EDAM balancing authority areas. So I don't know if that helps, Tong, but we'll also get to that question.
That helps, but I just want to make sure I understand. In this discussion, we're only talking about the interfaces between EDAM entities and EDAM entities, right?
That's right.
In this discussion, this slide only applies to that scenario. In ISO's questionnaire, you said it's internal. I want to make sure that that's not an error, typo or something. It meant internal.
Yeah, let us look at that, and if that says internal, it should be a typo. I don't have the questions in front of me, but
okay, then you should take a look, because that confuses us. Yeah,
because this section, and if you go up a couple of slides, Deb or whoever, these next number of slides, what Deb is trying to do is kind of do a recap of everything we talked about transmission in relation to transfers between EDAM balancing authority areas.
Okay, all right, thanks.
Yeah, but I do think, Tong, just to go back, and maybe this is a point of clarification as well as to your early question, when we're talking about the context of oat sales being paused in the context of bucket 3 transmission, I want to make sure that we're talking about it, again, in the context of these buckets. So what you would be effectively pausing in this, if you're looking at here at 10 a.m. to 1 p.m., if you're making bucket 3 transmission available, unsold ATC, what you would effectively, in my mind, and let's clarify this here if it needs to be clarified, but in my mind, what you're pausing is sales at those interfaces between EDAM BAs. You're not necessarily pausing your sales at your interface with a non-EDAM BA. I don't see there being a need to pause those sales or internal sales, across internal plugins, et cetera, but really you're making available ACC at the interfaces between EDAM balancing authority areas, and to the extent that, especially early on, if not everybody's in the EDAM, you're likely going to have interfaces with non-EDAM balancing authority areas. And, I don't see necessarily a need for you to pause sales on those points, but squarely on those points at the interfaces between EDAM BAs.
I see. That's very helpful.
And I don't know if that, and I don't know if that changes, I don't know, from your side, whether you can do that and parse that out that way, and that may be an implementation detail for each EDAM entity or entity that joins the EDAM. But I was not envisioning that there would be a pausing sales of everything on Oasis. It's just, again, those interfaces where you've made the bucket 3 transmission available between EDAM balancing authority areas.
Yeah, that's very helpful. That offers a different perspective, different probably thought process. Thanks.
Okay. Thanks, Tom. Operator, next slide, please. So just going through the EDAM process, what will happen in running the extended day-ahead market is first the transmission for existing contracts that are self-scheduled. That will go ahead and be saved first. Then the balance of the transmission that is bid in will be optimized. The cost of the transmission becomes a component of the LMP, and it'll be part of the LMP both for the custom load aggregation point and the default load aggregation point, depending upon where the load is at. As we said in the last slide, the results are going to be published by 1 a.m. And then once results are published, all of those results will then roll over to the WEIM as base schedules. Having said that, though, for the EDAM BAAs, any capacity that is needed for the capacity benefit margin or transmission reserve margin will be up to that EDAM BAA to determine on an as-needed basis. Operator, next slide, please. So let's recap for bucket 1. Bucket 1 is both network and point-to-point energy transfers. So as Milos just said, it's a transfer between 2 EDAM BAAs. And the buckets, as we've said on earlier slides, are just transfers. They're not non-EDAM to EDAM, and they're not internal transmission. So the transfer is from a resource specific to a load, and they can be from a external generator into a EDAM BAA to serve the resource sufficiency test. To the extent that entities have issues, have already procured resources outside of an entity that doesn't want to become a EDAM BAA to begin with, then that's fine. You can still have those for your RSCs. There's no usage fee for the transmission because it's already been contracted, and the transfer revenue will be received for that. The ability for the market to recognize the bucket 1 may not be optimized, and it's the customer that's going to receive the transmission 1 revenue. So all of that stuff is stuff that we've talked about a number of times for bucket 1. It comes in at 9 o'clock. We need to make sure that the resource sufficiency evaluation is run and that everyone is good for the 10 o'clock market start. Operator, next slide, please. So for bucket 2 transmission, this is the point-to-point interchange transmission between 2 EDAM BAAs. It's voluntarily made available, and in essence, it's the transmission that has predominantly already been contracted for, but is not required for the resource sufficiency. You can elect to make it available in EDAM, but it cannot be recalled once it is optimized in EDAM. Now let's step through that. let's say that you voluntarily make it available in EDAM, EDAM runs, but it's not needed in the optimization. So at 1 o'clock, then the report comes out, the transmission is not used, then that will go back to the transmission entities that made it available, and you can go ahead and sell it between the 1 p.m. and the start of EIM. And actually, that's all that's on that slide. And then the next slide, let's go to the next slide, is where Milos wants to take over. So Milos, if you wanted to add anything on that first slide, go for it. Otherwise, these slides are yours, yeah.
Sounds good. Sounds good. Thanks, Deb, and good morning, everybody. Again, this is Milos. Just if we can go back just one slide, just to note, it's going to help teeing up this next slide. But you know, the concept here is that bucket 2 transmission is voluntarily made available to the EDAM in return for these transfer revenues, congestion rents, effectively. And the one method that we talked about when we kind of had a focused discussion on bucket 2 a couple of weeks back was a party electing to make transmission available in advance of the market run, and you know, somebody has a 100-megawatt point-to-point reservation, you know, into or out of across a transfer point between EDAM BAs, and they elect in advance to make that transmission available. That's what we talked about, this concept that highlighted, that once you make that election, the market needs to be able to rely on that transmission, and you can't come back then, you know, and you know, take that transmission back in real time. You've chosen in advance of the market run to make that transmission available. And I envision here there will be some process that will need to be worked out at the EDAM entity level through their own stakeholder process of how that's communicated, how a party that decides to make transmission rights available communicates that to the EDAM entity, that they can verify that there are transmission rights that are held and that are of the appropriate quality that can be made available. And there may be some timelines associated with that, but I think that's left at the EDAM BA level to determine what's that best way of informing the BA and ultimately the BA informing the ISO as to how that transmission that's elected to be made available is made available. I think that's the most straightforward case of voluntarily making transmission available. What we did tee up, and if we can go now to the next slide, is what we did tee up in the past for consideration is this concept of, well, you know, in the effort to make transmission available and maximize the amount of transmission that's made available to the EDAM, you know, to optimize and to derive those benefits, is this concept of, well, you know, I can elect to make my full reservation available to the EDAM in advance, but what happens if somebody has a reservation but hasn't scheduled that transmission by the time of the market run? They haven't elected in advance to make it available, but it's just they haven't scheduled on it. So there's an amount, either the full amount or some lingering amount that's remaining that hasn't been scheduled by the time of the day-ahead market run, that the market could still utilize. It's of the same quality. It's firm point-to-point that hasn't been scheduled on. And could the market utilize that transmission and optimize it, again, to derive those mutual benefits? And that's this concept of unscheduled firm point-to-point transmission. And this concept, again, considers that firm point-to-point transmission that hasn't been reserved, that hasn't been scheduled by the time of the day-ahead market could also be made available then to support EDAM transfers for the market to optimize those transfers between EDAM balancing authority areas. And we talked about this concept that there's already something here that could support potentially with some, you know, changes to the tariff potentially that may be needed, but there's this concept in the pro forma tariff, and I recognize that certain tariffs may already have been modified and moved away from that, but this is the pro forma tariff, and I think a number of entities have this type of a provision in that parties could consider. But essentially, in that section of the pro forma tariff, it puts forward the concept that if transmission is not reserved or is not scheduled by 10 a.m., then it will, any kind of uses of that transmission or schedules after that time frame would be accommodated if applicable. if practicable. And so I think this provides an opening for consideration of whether, to the extent the EDAM entity was amenable to this, that the concept that if transmission is not scheduled, if this firm point-to-point reservation is not fully scheduled by 10 a.m., that unscheduled portion then could automatically be made available to the market to optimize that transmission. And so I wanted to have a bit of a discussion on this. Is this a viable approach? Because I think it may merit us including this in the comprehensive straw proposal, at least for vetting and getting some broader, more formal perspectives on. So let's go to the next slide, please. Okay. So what this would mean is then, as I mentioned, by 10 a.m., ahead of that day-ahead market run, the EDAM entity, through whatever process they are able to gather the unscheduled transmission now that transmission, the firm point-to-point transmission that hasn't been scheduled and that's held under a reservation. But the EDAM entity could then choose to make that transmission available to the EDAM for optimization to support those transfers. I would envision that this would be applicable to OAT contracts or OAT transmission rights that are executed under the open access transmission tariff, so that the tariff potentially would be modified or clarified through business practices or whatnot, that if you hold transmission rights under an OAT contract, under an OAT reservation, that unscheduled point-to-point firm transmission could be made available. I think this gets a bit trickier and probably may not be applicable to legacy agreements that are pre-OAT agreements executed prior to the adoption of the OAT framework by a particular BA. There may be different provisions there than the OAT, and that could be left to the discretion, again, of the EDAM balancing authority area, depending on what those types of contracts say and what the obligations are. But I think certainly in the context of the OAT contracts, it could be a viable framework to consider any unscheduled firm point-to-point transmission that could be made available for optimization. And then, in that unscheduled context, I think there needs to be also a recognition that, those parties who may not have scheduled, but they haven't elected in advance, but they haven't scheduled a full transmission reservation, they still hold that ability to exercise those transmission rights between day ahead and real time. The market may have some greater amount of unscheduled firm point-to-point that it's optimized, but there is that recognition that the party could come in that holds those transmission rights between day ahead and real time prior to the T-20 deadline for exercising those transmission rights. They could come in and schedule on those or submit a self-schedule in some way to exercise the use of those previously unscheduled transmission rights. And in that context, there is a risk that there may be some differences then in congestion costs between day ahead and real time to the extent that that party exercises those transmission rights. And the question then comes up, well, how does the EDAM entity, how does the EDAM BA and those customers potentially mitigate the exposure to some of those costs, to the congestion costs, to the extent that they do exercise the rights in real time that they may not have scheduled in day ahead. So that's an open risk with this approach, is that if the transmission that's unscheduled under a firm point-to-point reservation is made available to the EDAM for optimization through the day-ahead market, and the market uses those transmission rights, that if now somebody comes in, that transmission rights holder comes in real time and utilizes those rights, again, via likely a self-schedule, that the market may need to re-optimize, and there may be potential exposure to different congestion in costs in the difference between day ahead and real time. So let's go to the next slide. So again, still in that context of unscheduled firm point-to-point transmission rights, just putting forward a potential approach if parties wanted to consider this framework, but there may be some uplift costs, some congestion differences in real time between day ahead and real time accruing if a party exercises those rights, those unscheduled rights in real time. And, how does the BA deal with those costs? And one approach here that parties could consider, and again, the framework here is that transfer or congestion rents, transfer revenues associated with bucket 2 transmission, those transfer rents go to the EDAM BA, the EDAM entity. The EDAM entity is the one that's ultimately, dispersing those, has the discretion of identifying a framework on how disperse those amongst its customers or amongst its load. But one approach here could be that to the extent that somebody does exercise those transmission rights in real time, how can the EDAM BA manage the risk and try to keep the entity whole? And one potential approach is that the congestion rents that are paid under Bucket 2 transmission, they're paid to that EDAM entity, the transmission provider, and they could use potentially those congestion rents to offset any kind of congestion uplifts that may materialize through the use of those or exercising those transmission rights in real time. I think the BA can do different things to manage that exposure, making it clear to entities that there's some exposure if you exercise those rights. But one way is that if there's a surplus of congestion rents, they could utilize those congestion rents to manage any kind of uplifts created in real time on the congestion side from the utilization of those rights. If there's a surplus of those congestion rents, that they could consider allocating that to measure demand or otherwise appropriate customers that have made transmission available. If there's a shortfall in congestion rents compared to the uplifts in congestion created by the exercise of those transmission rights, and think of an extreme scenario: everybody who hasn't scheduled their firm point-to-point transmission rights, the market has used those, and now everybody comes in and uses them for some reason in real time. If there's a shortfall, then the EDAM BA would need to consider if they allocate that shortfall to measure demand or allocate it to the customers that have particularly exercised those intraday schedule changes to utilize those previously unscheduled transmission rights. But the concept here is ultimately that parties could elect to make transmission rights, and then there's no ability to come back and use them in real time. And then there's this concept of unscheduled transmission rights that somebody hasn't elected to make it available, but they haven't also scheduled those full transmission rights by 10 a.m. in the day ahead. The market could optimize those to derive benefits of optimization and of those EDAM transfers. But if the parties choose to exercise those previously unscheduled transmission rights, there's an exposure there to potential congestion uplifts. And the way to potentially deal with those congestion uplifts is at the discretion of the BA on how they want to do that. But one potential way is to utilize the congestion rents that parties get under Bucket 2 to try to keep parties whole. And if there's a surplus, any kind of surplus could be allocated amongst its customers, its measured demand, or the individual customers that made transmission rights available. If there's a shortfall, the BA would need to consider, do they allocate that shortfall across that measured demand or the individual customers now that exercise those transmission rights. So there's a consequence to financial implication there if they do exercise those previously unscheduled transmission rights. So that's all I had on this concept, and I think those are the 3 slides I included in here to foster some discussion. I don't know if stakeholders have any perspectives on this concept of unscheduled transmission rights, but we talked about it a bit throughout a couple of different presentations in the context of Bucket 2. I would envision that we would pose this in the straw proposal. We would put some more details to it and frame it as we did here to get some more formal stakeholder perspectives through the straw proposal. And then we can, based on that feedback through the iterative design process, we could hone in, is this a integral part of that Bucket 2 framework or something a bit more optional? But wanted to see if I don't know if there are any questions on this. Hopefully I didn't lose people. The concept here is unscheduled transmission rights.
Operator, can you open up the line for Callie Wells, please?
Hi, it's Callie Wells with WPTS. Thank you for walking through this topic in a little bit more detail. It was very useful for me. I have a question on this potential risk in real time. So if the entity comes back and wants to actually exercise those rights that were initially unscheduled in real time, obviously one of the risks is the cost of having to redispatch around that new self-schedule in real time. Could there be a situation where the market doesn't have enough economic offers to redispatch, and you can get into a situation where some self-scheduled transfers need to be cut?
Good question, Callie. I don't know, George, I mean, do you see that as a potential risk if these parties come back in? They're just self-scheduling, effectively exercising those rights. I guess it could potentially be, but any thoughts?
Yeah, we assume that there's going to be enough transmission capacity in the opposite direction so you can counterflow. It's hard for me to imagine a situation where you don't really have bids in real time to perform this action, considering that all the capacity awards from the day-ahead market, including these additional products now for imbalance reserve and reliability capacity, have a must-offer obligation in real time, which means they have to be available with bids. So I guess, Kali, do you have a specific scenario, maybe an example that we can look at that, then we'll probably be able to analyze it. But right off the top of my head right now, it's hard for me to imagine that we'll have to cut a self-schedule unless there is, of course, a transmission outage. If there is no transmission outage, there should be sufficient transmission capacity and bids to even counterflow on it, which is okay, right?
Yeah, I think in that scenario where you have enough economic offers to counterflow makes sense. But I'm just thinking of if there could be an edge case where you don't have enough economic bids to provide the counterflow, and if you can get into a situation where the market might have to start cutting self-scheduled transfers. My question was, or I guess a topic that might warrant further discussion is, now are we getting into the priority of those self-schedules? So if some of them are scheduled in EDAM from the day-ahead market, are those going to have higher priority than the ones that come in real time? And I'm just teeing that up as, something that if we go down this path might warrant further discussion on, which self-schedule gets cut first.
Yeah. And this is a great question, Callie, at least putting it in the context of that edge case. I think most of the folks that are participating in Working Group 2 also participate in Working Group 1, but we are I would encourage folks, to the extent you're just focused on Working Group 2, we just started yesterday actually, in Working Group 1, talking through that particular question, Callie, of stress system condition, emergency conditions, some of these edge cases. What is the confidence in EDAM transfers, and what happens really between day ahead and real time in these edge cases? And we walk through some examples. I think next Monday we'll include a transmission scenario where you lose transmission that impacts transfers, and how the market will resolve that. And then it gets into that question, I think, of who has what responsibility and priorities, for lack of a better term, discussion. So I would encourage for that discussion, if anybody's interested, we will be tackling that within Working Group 1. We started that just yesterday, and we'll continue it here, I anticipate, over the next meeting or two in that topic. And we plan to consider that kind of an edge case of loss of transmission between day ahead and real time across that supported EDAM transfers. And what does that edge case look like? What kind of questions does that raise? And who has what responsibility to maintain those transfers? And or are they, what are the implications of the transfers? Is there a priority for taking action on them?
I appreciate that you're addressing it on that one too, and to the extent that you walk through kind of an edge case similar to this, if it would be useful for those that maybe don't follow both, to bring that conversation back in here as well, just as maybe kind of, or in the straw proposal at whatever point, just kind of bring that.
No, great question. No, appreciate it. Thank you, Callie. Yeah, we'll see if if time allows. I think depending on how we finish or how much of these slides we finish here over the next meeting or two, I think we can certainly bring that connection back to the extent parties are not able to participate in Working Group 1.
Okay, great. Thanks, Callie. Operator, can you open the line for Stuart Kelly, please?
Hey, thank you, Debbie. Milos, really appreciate you putting on the detail here. When it comes to this surplus and shortfall, I guess I'm kind of interested in some feedback, folks' feedback. I appreciate there's options to allocate to the measured demand, but I would imagine more equitable thing to do for any surplus or shortfall is to allocate it to the customer that, didn't elect to schedule the firm point-to-point by 10 a.m. And just, I see Dave Rubin's on. Dave, would that fit with the more general philosophies you had around or thoughts you had around those surpluses or shortfalls, so that the other customers aren't carrying the cost for that? That, even though there's options here, that ultimately the surplus or shortfall goes back to that customer with the firm point-to-point that's been unscheduled.
Operator, can you open up the line for Dave Rubin, please?
Let me see.
I believe Dave just muted himself. I've unmuted again.
Oh,
there you go. Oh, Dave, you double muted yourself. There you go.
All right, another 6 weeks of work groups and we'll figure all of this out on the technology side. I think the short answer to your question, Stuart, is yes. I think that's sort of what we were kicking around is if we're going to try and push something back to 10 a.m. and release this transmission, which I completely agree with those who think more is better, and there's some very important transmission that we could free up by doing this. I think one way of allocating it would be to the customers who have made the change as a way of, on a cost causation basis, that may make some sense. Alternatively, if the broader group's feeling is that no, it's been an existing expectation, at least for the customers who are currently taking out service, then doing it as a broader uplift, may make sense, at least to start out. It's hard to know because it may be very different for different EIM entities with different quantities of point-to-point service here. But I do sort of, I think, side with where you were going, Stuart, which is to make it more customer specific on a cost causation principle. I guess the only other thing I would add to the conversation is going back to some of the points Milos was making. I'm not sure why this should be an election by an EIM entity as opposed to a determination by the California ISO as the market operator that this is an important source of transmission for market efficiency, and thereby it should be an expectation that those entities participating in the market would do it. In other words, I don't know why we wouldn't want to make a level playing field of expectation amongst the EIM entities who would participate. Anyway, just some thoughts there, Jeff.
Yeah, that's a great point. I appreciate that point, and definitely, like you, would be interested in other folks' thoughts, because it just seems the right way to do it is just, go to the effectively cost causer, but it could actually be a surplus. So definitely interested in other folks' thoughts. Thank you, Dave. I appreciate it.
Okay.
Yeah, this is maybe Deb, I could just respond to David Rubin's last point, and I think we're certainly open to this potentially being kind of a requirement of the market for that level playing field concept. We'd certainly appreciate hearing from stakeholders, particularly Western EIM entities, their openness to this concept. If there's openness to this concept, I think that helps us then determine kind of that direction. But I certainly hear from the comments now that there's openness to this concept of unscheduled firm point-to-point transmission, being made available to maximize really the benefits and optimize those transfers between EDAM balancing authority areas. So that's something I'll also be interested in hearing is just the openness to this concept, aside from that election element of parties making that decision up front.
Okay, thanks, Milos. Operator, could you open the line for Kevin Smith, please?
Hey, Kevin Smith, Balancing Authority, Northern California. Yeah, I just actually want to now comment on Milos first. I appreciate how you laid this all out, because I do think it's extremely helpful. The way I was thinking it would work, and by the way, we generally support this concept right now, although, you know, we have our own internal discussions that need to fully gel, but from just everything that David laid out is exactly why we would support this. We want to see, you know, the maximum amount of transfers, and that's the only way that EDAM becomes successful. I think in my mind, just going kind of to Stuart's question, which I think was a really good question, and I was seeing the CAISO as being the entity from a market rule perspective tariff that would basically set the bar as the 10 a.m. and that any unused capacity, however we define that, you know, leaving aside the ETC question, because I think that is an issue for some entities. There really won't be a problem. For others, it could be significant. I don't know. For us, it's probably not as relevant, except maybe for WAPA internally within bank, because they do have a lot of existing contracts. But I think the CAISO would prescribe it, but in my mind, the allocation issue, other than the CAISO allocating revenues back to the BA, this seems like something that's an internal issue of allocation, and that may be BA specific, and there may be different reasons for how those costs get reallocated and how they choose to do that. But I'd be curious if there should be a prescription from the CAISO side on that. But I was thinking there's kind of two levels. CAISO sets the main issue, which is the 10 a.m. and what happens after 10 a.m. on bucket 2. But it would be up to us to deal with the below the line issues of how that gets reallocated. And then I did want to affirm Callie's question on the infeasibility, because or the edge case, because this was an issue that we were kind of struggling with, is more or less the question of, and let's face it, this whole design is really pivots on the edge cases. I mean, we all know that optimization works 99% of the time, but it's that 1 or 5 or 3% that we get into the August 2020 situation. All of a sudden we have, you know, challenges and decisions to make. And so in some instances you see it coming, in other instances, you know, you could have a major outage, wildfire, something you didn't anticipate. So I do think we need to discuss that, and I know we are going to, but in my mind, the FERC rules, so just differentiating between business practice, convention, and legal obligation. The TSP is obligated under FERC rules to provide that ability to schedule up to 10 a.m., after which it's done as practicable. And so there's no concrete guarantee that that entity will have its ability to schedule its full, you know, rights after that 10 a.m. Now, again, most of the time it will be able to be honored, but if we got into some of those edge cases, I think that is a potential risk for uneconomic adjustment. But, you know, the one way to resolve it would be to schedule that right by 10 if you see the train coming. If you didn't see the train coming, which is also possible, you know, that is, I think, a potential risk, but that's where we have to get into, you know, kind of the hierarchy of schedules. And anyway, I'll leave it with that.
Yeah. No, great point. Thank you, Kevin, for that. And I think I would tend to agree with you that you know, I don't think we would dictate and that's hopefully how I framed this particular slide, but I don't think the ISO would dictate how ultimately you reallocate or utilize those congestion rents, among your customers. I was just putting forward kind of a scenario, but I do think that would be at the discretion of the EDAM entity, and then what the ISO could put forward is this concept of considering whether it's voluntary or more of a market design element, as David said, to ensure kind of a level playing field among entities that are participating. So I appreciate
that. Yeah, and I actually didn't interpret what you said as dictating at all. So don't.
Okay.
I wasn't accusing you of dictating or prescribing. I think you did a good job laying it out. I'm just providing my opinion on this, which could be unique and others may differ with it. But my opinion is that you set the bar at 10 a.m. and it's up to the individual EDAM entity or OAT entities to make a decision how they allocate. But thanks, Milos.
Good. Yeah, thanks, guys.
Operator, could you open the line for Doug Boccignoni, please?
Hi, Doug Boccignoni for BAMX. I just wanted to support the idea of releasing the unscheduled transmission for use by the optimization in the IFM. If we wait until the real-time market to utilize that unscheduled transmission, then there's going to be a systemic mismatch between the transmission available for optimization in day ahead versus real time that would be predictable and I think problematic. I think these edge cases are important and that's can lead to big swings in value, but like if we're holding back that transmission every single day from the day ahead market, we're going to get weird results in the day ahead market that we ran into that with the ISO, with phantom congestion, with ETCs early on. We fixed it by making sure that transmission was available to the market while respecting the rights of the transmission customers to exercise their rights in real time. And I think what we found out was that, most of the time there was a non-issue. The transmission wasn't scheduled. It wasn't scheduled because it wasn't needed. It wasn't going to be used anyway. So, if we hold that out, we're going to lose a lot of value. I think it's true. Things happen, things change. And I think, as Kevin said, sometimes you're going to be able to predict that there's a problem and parties are going to make sure they schedule on their rights. And in those rare instances where you can't predict it, there's going to be consequences. And I think, the BAAs are going to have to figure out how they're going to deal with that and, how they're going to take the revenues from the times when there weren't problems to help them deal with the times when there are problems.
Thank you. That great point as well. Great point as well as to the potential implications of not having that unscheduled transmissions and the differences between the day ahead and real time and what's committed and how. So appreciate those points. Thank you.
Operator, can you open the line for Tong Wu, please?
Hi, Tong Wu from WAPA. I have some questions about the mechanism and assumptions, how this would happen, and also I have some questions about the cost allocation. First, I think this is a bucket 2, so this is not about the transmission capacity the transmission owner has. So this is about the transmission that the right holders have. And depending on the contract, probably some of the rights do not go beyond the day ahead scheduling time, and some rights would go beyond 10 o'clock. So here, I assume we're only talking about those rights that can't go beyond 10 o'clock. Otherwise, this issue is moot. That's my understanding. So, if my understanding is incorrect, let me know, because my rest of questions is based on that. So can somebody from ISO tell me whether my understanding assumption is correct?
Yeah, if you can go back that one slide up, maybe 26 or so. And let me see if I understood you correctly, Tong, but or I don't know if this helps, but I think I covered that this would be applicable to point-to-point reservations executed under under the oath framework. I'm not sure, and it may not. There may be some contracts that are legacy agreements executed prior to the oath that may have different types of prescriptions on scheduling or other terms that are not governed by the oath. But that's what I was thinking was in the context of the oath contract and oath transmission reservation rights, less on the legacy pre-oath agreements that are individual.
Okay, so you're not talking about the legacy agreement. Okay.
Right.
You're not talking about those existing transmission rights. You're talking about the rights under oath. So under that, okay, is that right?
That's right. That's right.
Yeah. Okay. So under that assumption, and you further assume that under oath, somebody can go ahead and claim that rights after the day ahead before real time. Is that an assumption?
That's right. That's right. They're assuming that if you have a firm point-to-point reservation, there may be some bumping involved later on, but yeah, that they can exercise those later if they haven't.
I see. So, and this is a bucket 2. Earlier we said that bucket 2 concept only applies to interfaces between the EDAM entities and the EDAM entities. And then in real time, so for somebody to claim this right and use it, and somebody would have to self-schedule something between the EDAM entity and the EDAM entity. Is my assumption correct?
I believe so. Yeah, I think that that exercise of those rights, would be where they hold that reservation, which is across those.
Would that be a ETSR or something? So that means the ISO market design would allow somebody to self-schedule after the day ahead and before the EIM to self-schedule that between EDAM BAA and EDAM BAA. Is that correct?
Right.
I see. And when this happens, let's assume that this entity has the right to use it. That then you would carve out that transmission for this party, and then it almost look like there's a derate of the transmission, and then you have to reschedule everybody. Right. That gets my second group of questions. When you redispatch, two things happen. So one is that you have a redispatch cost, not necessarily reflected entirely on the congestion revenue. It's just generators gets redispatched, and there's a cost, redispatch cost.
Potentially,
right? And there also potentially could be an increase of congestion revenue or price differences on that interface, right? And that potentially, intuitively, would be greater than what you have in the IFM, because now you have less transmission. So that difference needs to be allocated to somebody, right? So in your slide here, when you're talking about the redispatch cost, are you only talking about the congestion piece? It sounds like you're okay.
Yeah, I'm focusing on congestion fees just because I don't know if you remember a couple of weeks ago when we focused a bit on bucket 2. I think we did talk about the market is constantly re-optimizing. There could be differences in load forecast, could be all kinds of different things. So there's not, and James Lynn, feel free to jump in if I'm misstating anything, but I don't know that there's a distinct way of attributing re-optimization of generation to a particular exercise of different transmission rights. The market, again, is constantly re-optimizing based on a number of and a variety of different factors. But this congestion component is something that we can, I think, clearly attribute to that exercise of transmission rights.
So I just want to understand what we're talking about. I'm not advocating, to have that generation redispatch cost included.
Okay, So hey, Tom, this is James Lynn. It's going to be, because the between day ahead and real time, the footprint is going to change, and the amount of generation bids and that is going to be made available, as well as the overall transmission. The being able to identify the exact nature of a redispatch cost is going to be very hard. I've almost said it's impossible, but I'm sure someone can figure out a way. But it will be related to congestion differences from real time to day ahead, but it also could be related to the energy differences between real time and day ahead, and they can both be positive or negative, depending upon what the market reoptimization results are. So it's going to be hard to identify these redispatch costs.
Okay, so you mentioned the load. So I was thinking this is only the transmission, right? And the load is probably difficult to figure out either. Load and gen, there's no difference in terms of optimization. They're just,
well,
different
even
signs.
even from transmission, when it comes to the transfer, as you add additional EDAM BAAs, the market is going to reoptimize all that transmission.
Mm-hmm.
And so you can wind up with different flows or scheduled flows based upon that reoptimization, and it may not be tied to the simple fact that someone used their rights and self-scheduled their ETC tour rights.
Yeah, that's a good point. Right. And on the slide, can we move forward to the slide that talks about the cost allocation? Yeah, so here, when we talk about here the allocation, exactly what are we talking about? Are we just taking a simplified approach to say, okay, I don't care what cost the difference for this congestion revenue between the day ahead and real time. I just deem that as contributed by this kind of unscheduled transmission rights that have been reclaimed.
So if I'm in, interpretation of this, the last bullet is, and sorry, Milos, if you want to go ahead and speak first.
No, go ahead.
No, as the settlement system is, we'll calculate, and we're going to make sure each balancing authority area is neutral, and we are going to, in essence, calculate the congestion rents within that balancing authority area, and those congestion rents are allocated to the EDAM entity. Now, what this statement says is the EDAM entity can then utilize potentially those congestion rents and at their discretion use it to offset some of the redispatch costs they have identified that occurred because of this use of transmission between day ahead and real time. They may incorporate in there the transfer revenue costs that are being allocated to them as well, because it takes into consideration the transmission change between the two balancing authority areas and the energy difference, marginal cost of energy difference between the two balancing authority areas. They may be able to utilize these two combined costs to make sure that they're held harmless.
Maybe an example will be better. I cannot really catch all what you said. My intuitively, my original question was like, let's say day ahead, the price difference across that intertie, say, is $10. And so somebody gets paid $10, most likely the transmission right holder, because they gave up their transmission, so they are entitled to the congestion revenue. They get that $10 per megawatt. And then in real time, and they say that's $20. And their contribution of the transmission capacity to the market, say, gets reduced by a megawatt. So they're going to get charged $20. And so, but that $20 could be contributed by many reasons, not necessarily to maybe their action of using a megawatt is only one of the factors that contributed this congestion rent increase. So you could say, okay, they're going to get charged $10, or you can say, well, this gets allocated to everybody because you cannot figure it out, all the other factors. That's what my question was, but I don't know whether this is what you intend to show. I just want to understand what you intended to show here, these bullets. Did I understand it correctly?
Right, and James, let me, this is Milos. So here, really, what we're just trying to note is that they're just in the discrete context of the congestion difference between day ahead and real time, that and those costs that may be borne by an entity, how a party could utilize the congestion rents to offset some of those costs. I don't know that, like we said, all the other implications of exercise of those rights, to the extent there are any, the market is consistently re-optimizing. I'm not sure that we can, break those down further and attribute them to a particular exercise of transmission rights, but that's something I think the EDAM entity has discretion, and if there's a way that we can help in discerning some of those implications, or I think we can certainly do that. But I think this is more simplistically intended to capture that concept of accrued potential congestion costs between day ahead and real time that the party may have now caused by the exercise of those transmission rights.
It would be good, to have an example or something. Go ahead.
Yeah, and Tom, maybe I can point you as well. When we were doing, when we did the bucket 2 discussion a couple of weeks back, James Lynn walked through a number of examples there as well on the potential implications of exercising some of these transmission rights in real time. So he went through a number of scenarios, all of them with caveats that these could be potential consequences. But I think we'll also make sure that we commit to providing an example in the straw proposal as well.
Okay, I'll take a look at those examples. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah.
Operator, could you open the line for Dave Rubin? I think he wants to get in on this discussion.
Well, maybe just to tee up a question, actually back to Stuart, if turnaround is fair play, and to Milos, because, in listening to this discussion a little bit further, I wonder sometimes that when we start focusing on these buckets and the point-to-point, that we get a little too narrow. Because I was just sort of thinking, Deb, in terms of everything that we do, that is a change from the day ahead run into real time is going to potentially cause congestion and redispatch. And so there's no way the load forecast is going to be perfect, and the temperature and the renewable projections. And so if we start really focusing potentially on one customer and allocating the cost to that one customer with a change, maybe at least for the initial stage of an EDAM operation until we get a better sense. And to be honest, I think from the settlements perspective, it might be easier to implement where you treat the congestion on sort of a gross BA level. If there's the excess, it goes to measured demand. If there's a shortfall, the uplift is, allocated that way. At least as a way of trying to understand things till you see how it works operationally. And then, if there are particular actors that may cause something, I guess you could move off of that. But as a more simplistic approach, I just wanted to tee that up because it really isn't just the point-to-point customer who may be making a change here. All of our NITS customers may be having changes just because you won't be perfect in that day ahead projection.
Yeah, Dave, I'm starting to lean towards that direction just based on the conversation, and we kind of identify all those redispatch costs. So yes, I agree that and maybe it is too narrow just to think about it the way I was initially thinking about it, and maybe it's better to start with a more broad approach and maybe allocate to measure demand or something. And measure it. It's a really good conversation.
Yeah, no, very good point, David and Stuart. I'll note that I think this is how we do it at the ISO today, partly because of some of those challenges, but kind of allocating some of these implications to measure demand. But very fair point and something to consider, particularly day one. I think you're hearing that it might be difficult, if not almost impossible, at least some of to unwind the complete ramifications of an exercise of those transmission rights in light of everything else that the market is reoptimizing for. Again, load forecast changes, other changes on the system that can all lead to reoptimization between the head and real time. So very good point. Okay.
Operator, can you open the line for Tom Flynn, please?
Hi, this is Tom Flynn with Puget Sound Energy. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, I can.
Good, thank you. Milos, I just had a question around the bucket 2 transmission, and I'm thinking about the transmission that an EDAM entity would make available to the market that's bucket 2 under its contract rights, versus I think what we're talking about here is what would be unscheduled. And I'm assuming that an entity would make available, if it wanted to, rights that it had remaining that had not been used for bucket 1, that they could put that into the market to be reoptimized, even though it hasn't been scheduled, and that would be counted, that would not be included in the unscheduled portion of what we're talking about now.
Yeah, no, very good. Yeah, very good questions. If you have a point-to-point, let's take up simplicity, you have a point-to-point reservation, and it's supporting a resource in the RSC, and a portion of that reservation is bucket 1 transmission. Yeah, I would see that a party could come to the EDAM entity or the transmission provider and say, I want to make this full amount of transmission available next day for optimization. I don't need it, and I want to derive those benefits. So yeah, I could see that. And then you have parties that maybe didn't necessarily come out front, and they don't know what they may do, and so they just didn't make that affirmative notification or decision up front, but rather if they haven't scheduled it, then you come in and optimize those.
Okay, and I think that I kind of think of that second bit of optimization really coming through the TSP, who's through their oath is saying, hey, this is unscheduled, so we're going to choose to make it available to the market. Okay. Yeah, I think I just want to recognize that if it's that bucket 2 is quote unquote made available to market, but it's not scheduled, that would still be counted, if you will. Okay, great. Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Operator, could you open up the line for Rowan Chatterjee, please?
Yeah, hey, one question pertaining to bucket 2. I know there was discussion earlier, I think it was Milos who brought that up, which was pertaining to a potential hurdle rate for bucket 2 transmission. And I was just curious to know when that conversation was going to occur. I know we're only like 15 minutes today left for time. So just curious to know when that conversation, the ISO is planning to have it. And also, the second question I had was, so far, my understanding is that the compensation pertaining to bucket 2 is centered around congestion rents. I'm just wanting to know if the ISO has contemplated the concept of customers reselling their transmission rights to the market, or in some way, shape, or form as an option, perhaps to discuss with the group.
Yeah, thank you. I don't know, Deb, if you recall when somewhere in your slide deck, I don't know if it's in the congestion rent discussion where that question is raised to allow some time for discussion on bucket 2 and potential hurdle rate and whether that's appropriate. So I anticipate it will come a bit later once we get to the congestion rent allocation recap section of the presentation. In terms of reselling transmission directly to the market. I'm not sure if that's the concept you were referring to, and directly to the market. I don't think we would be necessarily considering that. I think, I think that's something that parties would need to work through the EDAM entity to the extent they've acquired transmission rights via resale. I would envision you could make it available to the EDAM, but not necessarily something that you would directly, interact necessarily. Just I don't know if you meant the kind of reselling it to the ISO in some way or to the market at a rate. I think that comes in the context of maybe the hurdle rate discussion if there's merit to a hurdle rate for bucket 2 transmission, but not independent of that, if I understood the question.
Yeah, no, thanks, Milos. I wasn't really anything specific about whether or not it has to be resold to the market or resold to EDAM participants. I just, there is in the outside the TISO framework, transmission resales or transmission right to resales are a very common practice. And I just wanted to sort of understand if there has been any discussion on that front so far, and if not, if that is something that the ISO might entertain, because right now what I'm gathering is that the only avenue for collecting revenue on this bucket 2 is congestion rent allocation, which is, that's a great conversation, obviously, but I think that if there's an alternative to be explored, it's definitely worth having a discussion. Obviously, keeping in mind that we're not prescribing that it has to be resold to the market or to the EDAM DAAs. That's the topic for discussion. And
I don't think we've necessarily delved into resales specifically. I think we can have the discussion again of if bucket 2 transmission that's made available, could it be made available at a hurdle rate in addition to the congestion rent? But I think more broadly, at least for my part, I would envision that through the discussion with the EDAM BA, whether transmission that's resold, somebody is not the original rights holder but acquires it through resale, could that be made available as bucket 2 transmission? For my part, I don't see an issue with it, but I don't know if there are any nuances there. But I would just see if you hold those transmission rights and whether you acquire them through resale, reassignment, or you got them directly through procurement from the owned entity. It's still transmission that you hold that could be made available to the market. But that may mean if there are some nuances there as to what really goes into bucket 2 based on the different transmission providers' rules. Maybe that's discussed more under those processes. But again, for my part here, what we're looking at bucket 2 is whoever holds those transmission rights, however they acquire them, they can make those transmission rights available to the EDAM if they're of that quality from point to point. Under bucket 2, they can make it available to EDAM in return for congestion rent. And then there's that openness, that discussion once we get to it. Is there some openness in having some more robust discussion about hurdle rate associated with bucket 2 transmission?
Got it. Thank you.
Operator, can you open up the line for Kevin Smith, please?
Hi, Kevin Smith Bank. I kind of want to address that question, but by underscoring what David and Stuart's conversation, and I think I'm on the same page. There's got to be kind of an underlying concept that we have to keep this design as clean and simple. It's going to change. It's going to have to evolve. And so we're going to have to find kind of a baseline that we need to, to set the market. And clearly we're going to be making changes. And that kind of goes to this point that was just raised. We've talked about having some incentivized approach to bucket 2 because of, just potentially having transmission left outside of the optimization. It's just not going to create an efficiency that we want. And we could get incent a lot more participation. But I think as let's say a phase 1 base issue, I think what we've resolved, at least discussing among several EDAM entities or EIM entities, but not all, was that as a kind of phase one approach, we would be going to something like we've discussed already, congestion being the incentive, and then testing and seeing what happens. If there isn't sufficient liquidity, that we're not seeing the releases that we otherwise would expect, I do think this 10 a.m. gets into that, addressing part of that problem. But I do see this as a reasonable topic to discuss at some point, particularly if the market demonstrates it needs that incentive, but it could be a real complex issue to initiate on day one.
Yeah, thank you for that, Kevin. Yeah, and I agree. I think that's partly kind of how we noted it as well as we were going through the congestion rent discussion a bit earlier in the working group sometime back. That's a worthy point to keep in mind. I think through a number of these design elements, EDAM as a whole, but just that, day one, what are those key elements, and trying to keep it simple, recognizing that as we gain experience, knowledge, there's an opportunity to evolve similarly how we've evolved the Western EIM over time, responsive to different things that we learn, different concepts. And like you said, in this context, I think we're open to continuing the discussion. But yeah, I think it's fair to keep in mind that there's some evolution that can occur here as we see the value of the congestion rent as an incentive. So thanks for that. And I think that's it. Thank you.
Okay. Operator, let's go ahead and go to the next slide. So the last slide in the transmission bucket section is on bucket number 3. So, well, that's not true. We do have a few of these. Actually, Milos, do you want to start bucket 3 now, or do you want to wait on bucket 3? We only have 6 minutes left. Do you want to wait?
Can you just go down? I don't remember what comes after this slide, just so I can see if there's something.
Sure. Next slide, please. It goes into how the different transfers are made available, and then next slide is how it rolls into the Western imbalance energy market.
Okay. Okay. Yeah. Well, let me tee up bucket 3 then, and then I think you and George, I think they can cover these next ones when we come back. But I'll just tee up bucket 3 just because we thought we had a separate discussion on that. If you wouldn't mind just going back to bucket 3 slide, I can see what's on it. But bucket 3 transmission is that unsold, unreserved, firm ATC point to point that the party hasn't I misstated point to point. Just firm ATC that hasn't been sold at the particular transfer point between EDAM balancing authority areas. I think this gets back to the conversation Tong and I had a bit earlier. What we're talking in these buckets is really that transmission between EDAM transfer points and the EDAM entity would not be making firm ATC available, at transfer points with non-EDAM entities. It's just those points, interfaces between EDAM entities. And what we talked about here in the context was firm ATC or this concept of otherwise highly reliable, which I think refers to that there may be certain margins that entities may hold, that the CBM, TRM, that maybe it's released as firm, or maybe it's released as non-firm, but it's not necessarily otherwise, it has unique elements to it that party could make available here under bucket 3 transmission. We can define that a bit more. But ultimately, this is unsold and unreserved firm ATC that's made available on the timeline that we talked about, that Deb covered earlier on. It's made available at 10 a.m. And then we need to go through the market run. And I think we need almost every minute of that 3-hour period to be able to derive utilization of that transmission to support EDAM transfers. And to the extent there's transmission that's not utilized associated with this bucket 3, let's say you made available 100 megawatts of firm ATC at a particular interface. If only 50 is used, the other 50 would be made available back to that entity to continue to make those sales. But there will be the concept here is that this is now made available at a usage rate, at the particular OAT rate for firm transmission that the party may have. And the concept is that because buckets 1 and 2 transmission are not associated with a hurdle rate, the market will optimize those first and then go to the transmission that's associated with the hurdle rate, the bucket 3 transmission. And I think the open question that we, I think, had left open for discussion, but I think this also falls into the concept in my mind of, is this a day one element or is this a concept to consider and evolve? But it's this concept of, well, could non-firm transmission also be optimized, be made available, as bucket 3? And I think that, that opens up a number of different implications, a number of different questions on the firmness and dependability of EDAM transfers, because now we're talking about lower quality transmission. And when you get into that lower priority and lower quality transmission under the OAT framework, there's a number of different non-firm products that I think, all the way from hourly non-firm to monthly non-firm or potentially 6NN transmission, depending on how the entity calculates these. But I think it opens up a number of different more complex questions that I think introduces a new element of uncertainty potentially, and if EDAM transfers are supported by non-firm transmission. Not to say that this is not something that would be open to considering, but I think something to keep in mind is this a day one element, or is this something that as we get our legs under us, learn and experience kind of some of the benefits of EDAM, that we can explore maybe some of these optimization of non-firm transmission as well. Because I think if you do non-firm in bucket 3, not sure, how it relates to bucket 2. Could non-firm then be made available as well in the bucket 2? And it's not something unique to bucket 3. But just wanted to tee that up. I know it's 10:59, but that's, I think, the only slide on bucket 3. And I think, the next slides, it's something for Deb and George and others to get into next time once we get into that.
Okay, thanks, Milos. With that, we'll go ahead and stop here and pick up the deck on Tuesday. Thank you, everyone, for participating in the discussion. We greatly appreciate your viewpoint. And with that, operator, can you go ahead and close the call?
That concludes our conference. Thank you for using Event Services. You may now disconnect.